Tens of thousands of visitors go to the First World War battlefields every year. The centenary of 1914 piqued interest, with large ceremonies commemorating the key battles, and the media awash with dramas, art installations, and documentaries on the war. Most schools now have trips there as part of their syllabus. So it was by no means original that my friends and I went on a visit, 6 months after the anniversary of the war's end. John and I had never been. Rob had been to some of it once, but a long time ago. I have been fascinated by the war since I was a boy, and as a writer of sorts, it has often featured in my material. For some reason, I was yet to see the sites where it all happened. These are places that anyone interested in the history of our country, or indeed all of Europe, should see. It's a very good thing so many do. Most of us will have some family connection with the conflict. Whether they survived the carnage or died in it, we owe it to them, to help us understand in some small way what they went through. Nowadays, we can't truly appreciate what the ravaged landscape of northern France and Belgium looked like during the war. Nature very quickly took hold again, covering up mankind's crimes with green foliage, and of course the hardy poppies that now symbolise the conflict. But the monuments and the vast cemeteries remain. While this war stays relevant and close to living memory, they will be lovingly tended. Or in the case of various privately owned museums and gardens, such as this one at Hoo-Ha Crater, the spent munitions and barbed wire are left to rust. These, rather than the sad alabaster beauty of gravestones, seem to take you a little closer to how it was. So what of our family connections? My family was not involved in frontline fighting. 2 of my grandfathers were in the service corps, tasked with digging trenches, repairing positions and burying the dead. One great-uncle was in the Merchant Navy, and another was a bike messenger for the Essex Regiment in Ireland. One of my grandmothers was 8 years old when she witnessed a Zeppelin going down in flames after being shot down over northeast London by William Leaf Robinson. One of John's great-grandfathers was a frontline soldier in the Sherwood Foresters, coincidentally a regiment featuring his surname, and went missing in action, possibly at the Battle of Arras. Part of our trip was to find his name on the memorial he was supposedly recorded on. There were rumours he was on the famous Men in Gate as well, but nobody had verified this. He wasn't on the gate. Rob's great-grandfather, Edward, fought in the Sussex Yeomanry. In the Second World War he served in the Home Guard. He wasn't too vocal on his experiences in the war. He apparently made the odd comment, one which implied he found it easier to knock down enemies than to pick up their bodies afterwards. Family lore also tells how he returned from the trenches covered in lice and had to be scrubbed clean by his mother before he entered the house. A surviving photograph with his unit shows him in France. To serve in both wars was a real achievement.
My mother's father volunteered in 1914 for active service. He was from South Wales, he was from Aberdare, and he served in the South Wales Borderers and the Royal Welsh Fusiliers on the Western Front, was wounded twice, and eventually rose to be a second lieutenant, and we still got some of his papers. He got engaged actually just before going out, and they married when he came back in 1918 when he finished his military service, and remained married for many years after that because he survived into the 1990s.
Did he go back and look at it? Or?
You know, I suppose he did, but he never talked about that. He talked a lot about the front experience, and he kept some of his photographs, and he kept his medals, of course, so I think he was proud of what he'd done. And he was talking about it right up until the end. It was a kind of... He actually remembered the Battle of the Somme more clearly than things that had happened the day before. He was not resentful, so it wasn't the stereotype of the disenchanted veteran. I think he was proud of what he'd done, but also felt it had been an awful experience. He was wounded twice, I think by gunshot once and by shrapnel. He was wounded just before the Third Battle of Ypres, the Passchendaele battle in 1917. Perhaps fortunately for him, I think he was pulled out of the line just before that started.
Did his injuries persist?
No, there wasn't permanent injury from that point of view. He was lucky, and he didn't give me the impression of having been psychologically traumatised by it either. Of course, the great majority of veterans weren't actually traumatised by it. The majority of people came back, the majority of people were not harmed physically or permanently harmed mentally, but they were given an experience that stayed with them.
After Ypres, we spent the night in Lille, and the next day we crossed the Belgian border again and visited Mons. My collection of First and Second World War poems, One Truth Remains, started when I heard an interesting tale about the Battle of Mons, the first large engagement of British and German troops. There had been a myth about soldiers seeing angels in the sky, holding off the German advance while the eventually beaten British withdrew. The author, Arthur Machen, later admitted he made it up. Nevertheless, the press had seized upon the so-called Angels of Mons as propaganda, and it spread like wildfire. This idea ticked a lot of boxes for me, and I soon found myself writing an epic long-form poem on it. I really plumbed my imagination, putting myself in the scene and exploring how some shocked and exhausted soldiers might have conceived they were seeing angels. 2014 saw the BBC 3-part drama, Our World War. The first part I felt was a rather silly affair. There was, however, a powerful scene where a cocky and cockney young soldier volunteered to man a machine gun and cover his comrades' retreat. He then survived, badly injured, was captured and was awarded a Victoria Cross. The next day I learned this was indeed a true story, and the soldier was one Sidney Godley, who had lived in my hometown after the war. He was to be honoured in a ceremony to mark 100 years since his deed, and as I had written a World War I poem, my local councillor Dad set me the challenge of writing one about Godley. I later read The Line Was Sidney at the ceremony. Again, I really dug deep, tried to empathise with Godley. It was a lot more personal than the Angels poem, and also a lot less negative. Here I expressed the idea that there was heroism in this act, and with the final line, "They came for you, they did not pass," I asserted that Britain fighting Germany was in balance the right thing to do. I was trying to do Godley justice, but not be over-dramatic or saccharine. The poem expressed our town's gratitude for what he and millions of others in both world wars did for our country. How did the war start? A quick recap. The world in 1914 was a delicate balance of competing imperial empires. The newest empire, Germany, the country having unified in 1871, was allied with the ageing Austro-Hungarian Empire. Russia was allied with France, and it normally supported Serbia, a burgeoning nation in the troubled Balkan region. Britain, meanwhile, was loosely aligned with France and was committed to respect the independence and integrity of Belgium. Germany knew it could not expand its empire anymore with the current situation, and was eyeing a conflict to alter the balance. It felt encircled by potential enemies. France, Britain and Russia were in turn eyeing Germany, also knowing that a war might have to be fought against the newcomer. When the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Franz Ferdinand, was assassinated in Sarajevo by a Bosnian Serb nationalist, Austria-Hungary, encouraged by Germany, invaded Serbia in reprisal. Russia hurried to the assistance of Serbia and began military preparations against Austria-Hungary and Germany. Germany then declared war both on Russia and on Russia's ally France. Germany had long been planning its course of action and moved to conquer the old enemy France quickly by moving through Luxembourg and Belgium before concentrating fully on fighting the Russians. However, this plan failed because of tough French and Belgian resistance and also the intervention of Britain's small professional army. On this western front, both sides soon became bogged down into trench warfare, whilst on Germany and Austria-Hungary's eastern front against Russia, the fighting was more fluid but just as brutal. Elsewhere, Italy declared war on Austria-Hungary in May 1915 in order to expand its territories in the Alpine and Adriatic regions. In October 1915, Bulgaria joined the Central Powers because it wanted territory in several Balkan states. It had been waiting to see how Germany and Austria-Hungary fared in the war before it committed, and now believed the Central Powers would grant Bulgaria this territory in return for its support. Romania joined the Allied side in August 1916, desiring the disputed Transylvania and southern Dobruja regions, controlled by Austria-Hungary and Bulgaria respectively. The Allies wanted Romania to cut off the oil supplies that it was selling to Germany, and also to bar access to its railway system, which helped link Germany and Turkey. The Ottoman Empire, based in Turkey, allied with the Germans because of fear of Russia and increased military and trade ties with Germany. The Turks wanted to counter Russia's alliance with Britain and France, as all these countries threatened their territorial and trade interests. Britain and France also owned a high percentage of Turkey's national debt compared to Germany. Using warships purchased from Germany, the Turks carried out a surprise Black Sea raid on Russian ports in late October 1914, and the Allies declared war in response. In the Pacific and East Asia, Japan teamed up with Britain and France to seize German territories and further its own imperial ambitions. The conflagration that followed all of this was not, of course, the war to end all wars, but it is understandable why people at the time called it this, and once they witnessed the sheer destruction, hoped that it would be.
No, I wouldn't use the word inevitable. There are many signs that a war was likely, that Europe was a dangerous place in 1914 as an arms race. There were a succession of crises, diplomatic crises down in the Balkans in particular, and over Morocco. There was a lot of war talk. I wouldn't say inevitable, I would say likely. As the question is how it would escalate, well, one could see in retrospect how it escalated much beyond what anybody was expecting in 1914. And that perhaps there is more of an inevitability about that, given, as you've mentioned, the technology of the day which favoured the defence and made it very difficult to achieve a quick and decisive military victory. Well, the Germans were looking for security, and they felt encircled with Russia, France and Britain potentially combining in opposition to them. And they were worried that the arms race had taken off in Europe, which they were losing. So that made just carrying on with the status quo difficult, given their sort of prior assumptions that in certain circumstances it was better to fight than to accept political disadvantage. I think that they're not like Hitler, if you like. The German leadership before 1914 has much less sweeping ambitions than Hitler did in the 1930s. And really it's the differences between them and the Western powers, the British and French and the Russians, should have been settleable by compromise. There was an issue about colonies. There was an issue about naval expansion. They wanted a large navy, and the British felt threatened by that. I think what they most felt threatened by was Britain essentially combining with France and Russia against them in a European war, but their own actions, of course, made that happen in 1914. If you look at the pre-1914 diplomatic negotiations, the main thing that the Germans were looking for was a British pledge to stay neutral in a European war. And the British never gave that because they thought that it would give the Germans a license for aggression.
I wasn't sure we would be able to find the railway bridge over a canal that Godley was defending. However, a very useful guidebook from the Tourist Information Office told us where you could find it, on the outskirts of the city. It was close to an industrial estate and off a busy ring road. Part of you had to wonder, seeing the state of it now, would he consider it worth fighting for? A facetious notion, but perhaps I was used to the majesty of the cemeteries and cathedrals by now. Still, it was pleasing to go to the actual spot, and for the only time on this trip, it felt appropriate to perform my poem there. They came on strong, they came for us, they came for me, I willed them not to pass. They became nothing as they entered my sights, killer ants at the end of the Vickers, a field grey trigger in my mind. Them or me, I was the line, for vital minutes the only man. They came on strong, they came for us, I took it on, I would never have passed. This is where I was in a full moon world, a violent player on a tragic stage. They'd handed me this fire to wield, to burn or be burned, I was the heel of war's boot, stuck right in. They came on strong, they came for us, they came for me, they had to pass. A Jerry medic found me, my enemy now, a kindly face with a concerned brow. He held my skull and called me brave. Brave or not, I'd done my bit, denying ground, our duty's name. I'd done my bit, nearly did for me, after armistice came a VC. They came on strong, they came for us, they came for you, they did not pass.
I suppose if I'd been in charge at the time and seen the circumstances that people faced at the time, I might well have made the same decision. It's difficult. I mean, you can take an absolute pacifist position and say in no circumstances should the country ever get involved in a war. If you don't take that position, what the British did in 1914 meets most of the Christian requirements if you want to go back to the Christian doctrine of just war, which is usually the starting point for these discussions. What they faced was a situation where the Germans had set an ultimatum to Belgium. They were invading that country. There was a need to make a quick decision. Britain wasn't actually legally committed to come to Belgium's assistance, but it had made a treaty, signed the Treaty of London in 1839, under which everybody, including the British and Germans, had pledged to respect Belgium's independence. The other side of it is the realist side, the view that it would be dangerous for Britain if Germany overran Belgium and got control of the Belgian seaports. If Germany was able to destroy France as a great power, then the likelihood was that the Germans would renew their naval race against Britain, and Britain would be threatened by that. So I can sort of understand why the decision was taken, but of course what people didn't have a sense of was the proportionality issue. In other words, just how high the cost was going to be to achieve the defeat of Germany. And if that had been known in advance in 1914, perhaps nobody would have taken that decision, and they would have tried harder to find a compromise. But both sides needed to find a compromise.
Yeah.
Germans needed to give ground as well as the British.
Do you think if Britain had stayed neutral, Germany would have won the war?
Yes, almost certainly. I mean, there are degrees of winning, but I think that the Germans would have emerged with most of what they wanted if they'd been facing France and Russia alone. The Germans came very close to winning the war, even with Britain in on the Allied side. If Britain had stayed neutral and Germany defeated France and Russia, it would have taken territory from France and Russia. We know a good deal, in fact, about what the Germans planned to do if they won the war. They would have turned Belgium into what they described as a vassal state under permanent German control. They would have taken a lot of territory from France and Russia and imposed reparations on those countries. The most likely outcome would have been a kind of Cold War between Britain and Germany and a naval race between them. That could well have led to conflict in the future crises between Britain and Germany. I think the likelihood is that it would have done. And the Germans would have been, in those crises, in a much stronger bargaining position than they were before 1914.
On the trip, I took a 1994 book by Jeff Dyer called The Missing of the Somme and read it steadily between sights in the car. Coincidentally, it partly depicted a trip 3 friends took to the battlefields of Flanders. It even had details of their tensions and slightly inappropriate banter, which seemed to hit a note of truth. They managed without a sat-nav, though. It is a very good book, a concise, conversational examination of the conflict and the art it inspired. Dyer discusses its portrayal in poetry and prose by veterans, contemporaries, and generations hence. He also takes particular interest in sculptures on monuments, the title coming from an inscription on the Thiepval Memorial. He especially discusses the sculpture at the next site we went to, the spectacular Vimy Ridge. Vimy Ridge was fought between Canadian and German troops as part of the wider Arras campaign. The Canadian Corps took the ridge between the 9th and 12th of April 1917 at the cost of over 3,500 men, with 4 VCs being awarded. The Vimy Memorial now commemorates all Canada's dead in the war, totalling over 65,000, especially those missing without a grave. It is not a militaristic structure like the Thiepval Arch. As Dyer observes, it seems to explore the concept of grief. Its architect Walter Seymour Alward describes his work as a sermon against the futility of war, and perhaps because 11 years had passed since the conflict, it could be done in this way. The sculpting is quite ornate by war memorial standards, but also stark enough not to be showy and distract from the simplicity of the statement. The engineers who oversaw the project found themselves with extra material and idling staff, and decided to preserve part of the trench system and underground tunnels. You can take a tour down the tunnels to this day.
the Germans could have won in the first 2 months, but they made bad mistakes, and the likelihood is that they weren't going to win. Their war plan was too ambitious for their military strength. So some kind of deadlock between the Germans on the one hand and the French and Russians on the other was fairly predictable in retrospect. And the trenches lines started forming very quickly. They started forming on the eastern frontier of France from August 1914 onwards, and trenches aren't just a feature of France and Belgium. On almost every battlefront in the First World War you see the same phenomenon of trench fortifications protected by barbed wire and machine guns and supported by railways and logistics. Given the prevailing military technology of the time, which favoured the defensive over the offensive, there was a near inevitability about the almost universal adoption of trench warfare in almost every fighting front. It's not just generals. The generals did give the order to dig trenches, but I think that the frontline troops are very willing to do that, because your first instinct almost when you're open in the air and in the open under artillery fire, you want to dig to protect yourself. And actually the highest casualties per day in the First World War were in the opening phase of manoeuvre warfare, so-called, before the trenches were dug. A good example is the French army, which on one day in late August 1914 had over 20,000 killed. That's not trench fighting, that's troops caught in open country under bombardment from German light field howitzers.
After Vimy Ridge, we went to the monument John's great-grandfather was apparently written on. The rain had rolled in, and it was very atmospheric. While Rob and I busied ourselves filming and taking photographs amongst the many graves, and I found a lovely horse, John checked the register and duly found the panel. We gave him some time with it, a private moment, and was silent more than we had been in the other cemeteries. Not to overstate this, but this was a different feeling, a tangible connection to our group. Even though none of us had known him, he was not merely a stranger, a statistic. It brought the reality of this war home somewhat, and I found it quite emotional by proxy. We lingered for a while, and then turned and headed for the car. We were done for the day. Rest in peace, William. We stayed for the next 2 nights in Amiens. It was in the thick of it during the war, and suffered much damage in both World Wars. The 1918 battle for the city began the 100 Days Offensive, which eventually pushed the Germans back to the Hindenburg Line and ended the conflict. It also had a good restaurant that gave us free shots of Calvados.
I think that the issue is not just trench warfare, but it's offensives. And that's what the generals are often criticised for, is that they're unimaginative in the use of their tactics for breaking through opposing trench fortifications. Neither side seems to have had an answer to this, even if many historians have argued the German generals were much more imaginative and effective than their British and French counterparts. They had a better system of learning from experience. They couldn't break through trench fortifications either. By 1918, both the British and French and also the German armies have found ways of breaking through trenches much more easily and with much lower casualties. Primarily, it's actually involving heavy artillery is the key thing. You need lots of heavy artillery. They didn't have heavy artillery or heavy artillery teams in the numbers that were needed until well into the war.
The once ravaged landscape of the battlefields is most tangibly shown by the huge craters left by undermining operations. Lochnagar crater, 98 feet deep and 300 feet wide, is one of these. On the first day of the Battle of the Somme, the 62,000 pounds of explosives were detonated along with the slightly smaller Weissap mine in a British attempt to take the village of La Boisselle and the 3 German trench lines behind it. Lochnagar got its name from the trench the tunnellers dug from, given a Scottish moniker by the Black Watch Regiment. Mainly Scottish and Irish troops were involved in the operation, along with the Grimsby Chums Battalion and the Suffolk Regiment. Immediately after the blasts, the British rushed in. On the Weissap flank, they were violently repelled. In Lochnagar crater, they pushed through the 3 lines, but owing to heavy losses and low ammunition, they had to pull back to the first line and occupy the area surrounding the crater. To the right of them, the German stronghold Sausage Redoubt was targeted, but the British were forced further right and took Scott's Redoubt instead. Only 2 gains were made, with 6,380 killed. This fitted in with the failure of the broad strategy of July 1st, 1916. The German lines were heavily shelled for a whole week beforehand, such that the British believed they would simply have to walk across no man's land. But the Germans had built deeper, more effective shelters than was realised. British shells were not high quality, with many duds, and the British had used the wrong type of shells, shrapnel rather than high explosive, to target the barbed wire placements, which stayed largely intact. Combined with our troops being deployed in heavy full kit and told not to break the slow walking formation in order to keep discipline, these factors meant the planned stroll became a massacre. Thiepval Memorial is the largest British Commonwealth War Graves Commission monument to soldiers missing in action. It was designed by Sir Edwin Lutyens, one of 3 architects hired by the Commission after the war. He designed the altar-like Stone of Remembrance, which is featured in all large British cemeteries proclaiming, "Their name liveth forevermore." He also designed our nation's primary war memorial, the Cenotaph. Thiepval is an awesome sight, with 7 interlocked arches layered on top of each other. As I said earlier, it is more militaristic in style and in keeping with the neoclassical British Empire aesthetic. That is not to say it is triumphalist. It cannot be triumphalist. The first day of the Somme was the British Army's largest single loss of life ever, at over 19,000 killed. Even though our Great War efforts eventually prevailed, the sheer human cost of the war, experienced in some way by every person in the country, meant there could be no crowing about victory. The monument is still very sobering. The poet John Masefield once described the site of Thiepval itself. Corpses, rats, old tins, old weapons, rifles, bombs, legs, boots, skulls, cartridges, bits of wood and tin and iron and stone, parts of rotting bodies and festering heads lie scattered about. A more filthy, evil hole you cannot imagine. When I did try to imagine this, and indeed struggled to come close, it made me reconsider the spot I had visited, with its families, neat lawns and friendly attendants. It felt strange. Lutyens has given this site dignified closure, yet as with many of these places, however sanitised, it still seems to brood. Perhaps this is the intention, or perhaps this is inevitable. Some months after the trip, we researched John's great-grandfather in more detail. I had happened to be filming Wanstead War Memorial, as it is quite distinctive, and unbeknownst to me, his name was right there in front of me. It was only later that I realised he had lived in Wanstead, from documents sent by John, and I checked it out. Lazily, I hadn't properly looked up any of our relatives' records, so I took the hit and used a pay site to do so. Lance Corporal William Charles Sherwood was in the 1st Battalion of the Sherwood Foresters. He was born in South Lambeth, Surrey in 1881 and died on August the 28th, 1918, aged 37. Records show the battalion took part in many offensives, and the date coincides with the Battle of the Scarpe, in which British and Canadian troops took the towns of Monchy-le-Preux and Wancourt over 4 days. Quite possibly he died here. A report dated 13/11/1918 declares him reported, wounded and missing. 1st Battalion arrived in France on 5th of November 1914. Quite possibly he was there, but he may have been a reinforcement at a later time. A document states he was wounded on the 6th of July 1916. He was married to John's great-grandmother Ada. He is also commemorated on a plaque inside St Gabriel's Church near Wanstead Flats. What of Rob's great-grandfather? The Sussex Yeomanry's 1st Battalion was amalgamated with the Royal Sussex Regiment in 1917. Private Edward George Lodge's record identifies him as being Royal Sussex, thus he must have been in the 1st Battalion. Rob has found this picture of him in the desert. Therefore, he likely served in the Middle East at Gallipoli and Palestine in 1915, before being assigned to the Western Front in 1917, being deployed on the 7th of May 1918. Although a yeomanry often rides horses, the Sussex yeomanry did not ride them during the war, and he would have fought on foot in the Middle East. I couldn't find much more about my relatives. Perhaps more research is in order all round, and now we know some more, it will make that easier. Also after the trip, I visited the RAF Museum in Hendon, which has a good First World War section, as well as the other eras of aerial warfare. A great selection, and all the better for the free entrance. The footage I took inspired me to write another poem about what it must have been like to be a fighter pilot in those early days of flying. Strapped to a pounding engine, air howling in his face, knuckles white against the stick, his young life hanging by a thread. Fabric on wood will snap and tear like skin on skeleton, crumple limp into the ground before the petrol burns it all. He is what a pioneer looks like, the very limit of man and machine. The gravity grips his stomach, twists and squeezes, pulls on limbs. The uninitiated would just straight black out, but he has obtained a thrill, a purpose. This could be a curse, but still. On he hurtles, goggles down, throttle out, chocks long away. His neck swivels, key to see, from where adversaries will swoop. With cold blurred eyeballs scans the wisps, stolen seconds from the controls. His tense thumb strokes the button ready to spit lead through the whirring prop. He is what a pilot feels like, terrified but adrenaline high. The black-crossed eagle at 3 o'clock whips across, a volley hits. The fuselage shudders as he peels away. His body seems to drain of blood, his heart pounds as if to break free. A silent scream fills his very being, but he knows to turn tail is surely death. He rolls and brings the kite around, under Fritz's bright red belly. He gasps to breathe, he grits his teeth, engages thumb and prays to Christ. The Ulster Tower is a monument to all the men of today's Northern Ireland who fought in the war. It is modelled closely on Helen's Tower in a country estate in County Down, on which many Ulster soldiers trained. Close to the Thiepval monument, it marks the spot where the Ulster Division and others captured a German stronghold, the Schwaben Redoubt, on the first day of the Somme. The division had 5,500 casualties, but was the only detachment that day to meet its objectives. Beaumont Hamill's Newfoundland Memorial honours the fallen of the then British Dominion, now part of Canada. It is on the site of another battle from the first day of the Somme. Following the British Hawthorne mine explosion, the Newfoundland Regiment, together with an Essex Regiment battalion, were sent to support the failing British attack and came into full view of German troops. The Newfoundland Regiment sustained 80% casualties, just another costly defeat in that dreadful 24 hours. Beaumont Hamil would see several more confrontations during the war.
Peace was possible. The most serious negotiations weren't the ones in 1916, they were the ones in 1917. When the Austrians and Germans put out secret feelers to the Allied side. They were serious offers. The Austrians and Germans wanted to end the war at that point because they thought they had the advantage. The Germans held a large amount of French territory, they held Belgium, which was crucial to the British, which is why they were quite attracted and interested in the idea of settling the war at that point. But the Allies calculated that with America in the war, they could get a better deal if they hung on for another year, and that calculation actually turned out to be about right, though it was still extremely costly. It meant hundreds of thousands more people were killed. So yes, you could have had a compromise peace in 1917, but the compromise would have favoured the Germans and Austrians. What that meant in practice, if you take Britain, is that the Germans would have controlled Belgium. That the German plan's quite clear that Belgium would lose its independence. It would be under permanent German occupation. The Germans would have naval bases on the Belgian coast. It would be in monetary and customs union with Germany, and Germany would run the railways. And the Germans had similar plans for a chain of sort of dependent buffer states in what's now Poland and the Baltic states on the Eastern Front. And they would also take in substantial and valuable territory from France, and they also had plans for a Central European customs union and for a worldwide chain of naval bases.
On the edge of the village of Verzy, on the biblically named Mont Sinai, there is a French observatory which was built to watch German positions on the opposite hills and the Marne Valley between. General Gouraud, in charge of the French Fourth Army, would do this frequently, and an extension from the nearby railway would take him there. There were several observatories built in the area surrounding Reims to bolster the defence of the ground secured during the First Battle of the Marne in 1914. 6 French armies and the British Expeditionary Force had managed to repel the Germans from their advance on Paris at the cost of 82,000 killed. This led to the race to the sea, where both sides tried to outflank each other, but ended up digging down into the static war of attrition that would last for several years. Le Fort de la Pompelle was built after German unification as part of a series of fortresses along the borders of France. By 1914, it was outmoded by artillery developments. It was, however, fought over and used by both the French and Germans, and helped make up the defence of the Reims area. 2 contingents of Russian troops sent by the Tsar were also stationed there, and it supported a naval artillery placement. On the 1st of June 1918, preceding the Second Battle of the Marne, it was heavily attacked by the Germans and 15 of their tanks. Like lots of places in France, it seems, it was shut on Monday.
I've seen a change in the attitudes of, if you like, professional historians of the war on some of the things we've been talking about. For example, the peace treaty. There's more understanding of what the peacemakers were trying to do in 1919 and more sympathy to the Allied side than there used to be. Military historians are now much more sympathetic to the Allied generals in the First World War than they used to be, understand the kind of the dilemmas that they faced, and it wasn't just that the generals were actually sort of stupid and aggressive brass hats, that they actually were trying to cope with difficulties that nobody quite knew the answer to. There's also another thing that's come out in the recent work on the war is that it was a popular war. There's a combination of things which happened in May 1915. Germans using poison gas, Zeppelin raids on London. This follows on, as you've mentioned, Germans bombarding Whitby and Scarborough at the end of 1914. As a report comes out in May 1915 about the German atrocities in Belgium. All of these things helped persuade British public opinion that they are fighting actually a particularly lawless and dangerous enemy, and this is a war for survival of civilized values. If you see it as just something which is foisted on the public by governments, I think you misunderstand what was going on. And also, of course, that a large number of people on the left supported the war. It's not just people on the right and the conservatives and nationalists. They accepted the war was a just cause.
And there was a Liberal government.
There was a Liberal government in the UK, yes, and it was a left-of-centre government in France as well. Later on, the British form a coalition, of course, but to begin with, it's a Liberal government, and a progressive Liberal government that had reformed the House of Lords, was trying to introduce Home Rule for Ireland, had brought in old age pensions and national insurance. So it was a left-of-centre Liberal government supported by Labour on many things as the government that brought Britain into the First World War, and only 2 members of the cabinet resigned over it. I'm not sure that there's actually falsehoods that people don't. It's just an incomplete understanding, if you like, rather than actually thinking things about the war to be true which aren't true. It is important to go back into the mindset of people at the time. This isn't necessarily to say that people didn't make mistakes at the time, but I think it's dangerous to assume that people at the time were any less intelligent or sensitive or aware of human tragedy than we are. One of the things that comes out at the time about the war experience is actually many memoirs show that people spent lots of the time not fighting. They were only in the front line for comparatively short periods of time. certainly in Britain, and I think to a lesser extent in France and Germany. So they weren't, if you like, continuously up in close combat, which is what you might get the impression of from looking at All Quiet on the Western Front.
We stayed the last night of our trip in Reims. It was an important city in France's history. It used to be where French monarchs were crowned since the 12th century. It changed hands during the Napoleonic Wars, and in the Franco-Prussian War it was occupied by the Prussians. During the First World War, the cathedral was badly damaged, which was used as a prime example of German aggression against French culture. The cathedral was restored over the following decades. In 1945, the Supreme Allied Command had its headquarters in the city, and the surrender of the German army was taken by President Eisenhower. A decent museum is now housed in that building. Eisenhower probably celebrated his well-earned victory with the Reims speciality of champagne. We made do by drinking strong French beer in a nice bar. So how did the armistice occur? After having pulled back to the Hindenburg Line in 1917, German General Erich Ludendorff went for an all-out attack in his 1918 spring offensive. This targeted the city of Amiens, where he thought he could split the British from the French and cut off their supply lines by seizing their key transport hub. He did this in conjunction with the deadly German submarine campaign against Allied shipping, and in the wake of Russia pulling out of the war in late 1917, which freed up German manpower. The offensive made great inroads into British-held territory by innovative use of stormtroopers, but was checked before it could reach its objective. The fighting had become fluid once more, for the first time since 1914, with the Germans committing everything to their attack, and becoming stretched in their own defences as a result. The Allies were quick to respond and take advantage of this, with the newly arrived American troops enthusiastic for the fight. In June, the Americans held back the Germans in the frenzied Battle of Belleau Wood. In August, Britain's General Rawlinson devised an Anglo-French combined arms offensive east of Amiens, using rolling artillery barrages, tanks and aircraft to support the well-briefed ground troops. The space became so open that even cavalry and cyclists were used. In the autumn, the Americans launched offensives in the Saint-Mihiel and Meuse-Argonne regions. Simultaneously, the Belgians pressed forward in Flanders, the British, Australians and the Canadians around Cambrai, and the French in Picardy and Champagne. The Allies were engaged in a powerful push against the Hindenburg Line, piercing it in several places until it finally broke. Tens of thousands of German troops surrendered, while others deserted. The Allies' naval blockade of German-controlled ports was starting to bite, and the leadership realised it had to sue for peace.
Their biggest single mistake, apart from starting the war in the first place, was bringing America in, which was unnecessary, and if they hadn't adopted what was called unrestricted submarine warfare in 1917, the Americans would not have come in. And if the Americans had not have come in, the counterfactual is fairly clearly points towards a sort of compromise peace in 1917, which would have been favourable to the Germans, because of the Russian Revolution, which I think was going to happen anyway, the French army mutinies, which were going to happen anyway, and Britain was nearing the limits of its ability to keep financing the war by 1917, and the Americans coming in bailed the British out financially, and that meant the British were able to bail out the other members of the Allied coalition. So if those things hadn't happened, so if the Americans had not come in, the Allies would have been thinking in a very difficult position. German mistake number 3, if you want to take this a bit further, is the so-called Ludendorff offensives in March to May of 1918, which speed up the end of the war and the German defeat. By the end of those offensives between March and May, their line in France has been very substantially lengthened, and their ability to defend it has weakened, because the German army is reduced in size by about 1 million men, and they simply can't replace those numbers. Whereas on the other hand, the Americans are arriving in strength on the Allied side, so the balance of numerical advantage shifts dramatically against Germany in the spring and summer of 1918. Less important than used to be said, some historians argued in the 1930s that the naval blockade had been the main thing which causes Germany to be defeated. I think few historians would say that now. The blockade worked extremely slowly. It worked a bit faster once the Americans were in, but right up to 1916-17, the Germans were still importing about half of what they'd imported before the war. Their ability to make munitions wasn't much affected. They were having to do expedients. They were having to line their shells, I think, with steel rather than with copper, which makes it less effective, but still their war effort wasn't really handicapped by lack of munitions. The key thing about the blockade is it made the Germans do stupid things, because it made them feel that time was against them. That's one of the reasons, a key reason why they did the unrestricted submarine warfare that brought America into the war, that they thought that otherwise they were gradually going to be suffocated by the Allied blockade. The American President Woodrow Wilson was extremely reluctant to get involved, and up until about March 1917, about a month before America came into the war, he would not have had a majority in Congress in favour of a declaration of war. What makes the difference is the German submarine attacks on Allied and American shipping, and to a lesser extent something called the Zimmermann Telegram, which was a German note to try to bring Mexico into the war on Germany's side, which the British decrypted and passed over to the Americans, and that had a kind of bombshell effect. But the submarines was the most important single thing, that the Germans were actually sinking large numbers of American ships and killing American sailors.
Ceasefire talks were pursued for 6 weeks prior to officials meeting in a railway carriage in the rural forest siding at Rathons near Compiègne. Similar talks had already been concluded with Bulgaria, Turkey and Austria-Hungary. The French Marshal Foch was the most senior participant, though attended only for the start and finish of negotiations. The two sides met on the 8th of November and remained in contact for 3 days, during which time the Kaiser abdicated on the 9th. After a few alterations and checks with the German leadership, the armistice was finally signed at 5:20 a.m. on the 11th, set to come into force at 11 a.m. Paris time. This was partly to give time to communicate the information to all units, but it was also a rather arbitrary symbolic time, with a nice ring of symmetry to add some mythology to the proceedings. It has been revealed that British PM David Lloyd George insisted on it, because he wanted to announce it in a speech scheduled 20 minutes later. This rather superficial decision made sure that many more would die in the last hours. Fighting went on until the final minutes, with American commanders especially wanting to take as much territory as possible should the peace agreement fail at a later juncture. They might have had a point, because after being postponed 3 times, the peace with Germany did not formally take effect until January the 10th, 1920, under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles.
The Treaty of Versailles has been criticised both for being too harsh and for being too soft. In this country, in the UK, the prevailing view has been that it's been too harsh. But many people argued that at the time it would inflame German nationalism. When the Nazis came to power, many people in Britain, including Lloyd George, British Prime Minister, argued that showed that the treaty had been a mistake. I have problems with that argument, because the Treaty of Versailles, whatever you may say about it, there is enough in it, if it's enforced, to make it impossible for Germany to start a major European war, particularly the disarmament provisions, which prevent Germany from having tanks, poison gas, aviation, military aviation anyway, reduce its army to 100,000, it's not allowed U-boats, it's reduced to a very small navy as well, and Allied permanently demilitarise the Rhineland. Germany's western border can't be fortified or garrisoned. So there's enough in there, if it's enforced, to make it impossible for Germany to start a major European war. And Hitler recognised that when he became Chancellor in 1933. He thought the first priority was to break out of those constraints and to rearm, which of course he was able to do. So I think, if you like, the real mistakes which make the Second World War possible and probably unavoidable happened in the 1930s, not the Treaty of Versailles. I think so, though this is something historians have argued about. The reparations section of the treaty is one of the most controversial sections of the peace treaty. It was savaged immediately after the peace conference by the economist John Maynard Keynes in his book called The Economic Consequences of the Peace, who argued that it was too harsh, it would cause starvation and chaos in Central Europe. What's happened since the 1970s really is historians have looked at this again, and they've actually got out their calculators and tried to work out what it would have actually meant if the reparations clauses of the treaty had been enforced. And probably what it would have meant Germany transferring about 7% of its gross domestic product to the Allies each year during the 1930s and 1940s, which is a lot. but it's not actually impossible for an economy of Germany's gross domestic product per capita in the 1930s and 40s. The other thing to say about the reparations clause is they weren't enforced, and about a sixth of what the Allies demanded from Germany was actually paid before reparations were cancelled in 1932. All of the Allied countries, including the Americans, accepted that statement, that they all thought that German aggression had caused the war. It wasn't really controversial, the war guilt clause from the Allied side. It was controversial in Germany, partly because there'd been a revolution in Germany in November 1918 and a new government had come to power, a socialist government. The socialists had supported the war in Germany. They'd voted for war credits, but they felt that the war had been caused by the previous regime. Also, many German socialists and progressives felt that the war wasn't just caused by the German government decisions, it was caused by the international system before 1914. Balance of power, secret diplomacy, militarism, alliances and all of this. And that, if you like, all the countries involved have been victims of that system. This is very much the view which people put in Germany in the 1920s, and a lot of British and American liberals, if you like, and progressives were sympathetic to that view. That, of course, is how Hitler saw it, very much. If you read Mein Kampf, it's the sort of foreign policy discussion in Mein Kampf is very much along the lines of Imperial Germany got it wrong, mismanaged the First World War, but the war itself is not something that's a bad thing. From Hitler's point of view, it's a means of progress, it's a good thing. It's not something which is just like a means to an end, it's a good thing in itself, and it's necessary and essential, inevitable part of life. So he expects there will be a Second World War, and the important thing the next time round is to get it right.
Fittingly for the day we were returning home, we headed towards Compiègne, where the armistice was agreed. On the way we found yet another large cemetery, Ambligny. The changeable northern France weather provided yet more brooding atmosphere as Rob and I backtracked along the busy road with lorries hurtling along it. We got some pictures and moved on, not even entering. The truth is, there are only so many cemeteries you can take in, and this part of the world has an abundance. Compiègne is a particularly tranquil spot, still and green, the only sound being birds singing in the trees and the occasional murmur of visitors. Perhaps it is mental association with peace enhancing that sense. It isn't especially attractive, the grey monuments and drab museum building giving the bleak but reverent effect of a modern municipal cemetery. But of course there are not masses of bodies under your feet here. Like the killing fields of Thiepval and Vimy Ridge, there is no triumph, except perhaps in the carriage being adorned with Allied flags and some sort of altar in the room next door. Unlike those sites, the knowledge that 4 years of unprecedented slaughter came to an end here allows for a little more hope and life affirmation. But that is in turn tempered by the sadness of knowing that, as a result of the uneasy peace brokered here, the world was to be consumed once more by the wrath of nations. In 21 years, an Austrian psychopath would indulge his vengeful obsession with Compiègne by making the French sign their surrender in the famous carriage before taking it back to Berlin. It would take 5 years of even worse slaughter, of death camps, burning cities and 2 atomic bombs, before the arson-charred wagon would be returned. This had not been an exhaustive trip. We didn't have enough time to see much more. As usual with such endeavours, the schedule had to be altered as we went along, and we missed a few key sites such as Passchendaele, Belle Wood, Cambrai and some of the largest cemeteries. Verdun was simply too far. The schedule also did not allow for much rest and relaxation, especially for John who was driving, for which we thank him profusely. The trip was about as much as we could manage with the time and resources available to us, but I was pleased with what we did manage. I got a lot of footage for the sites we did see, and it was good to sit down and put this film together. I would happily go back and visit more of this fascinating and moving area, forever linked with the vast human tragedy that unfolded across it.
Life would be much simpler if one could just take a simple, absolute pacifist position, and of course a lot of people do say that in no circumstances can it ever be justified. I remember an editorial in The Guardian which put this quite well, when it said that the trouble with violence is that sometimes it works. That if you adopt an absolute pacifist position, then inevitably you're driven towards appeasement and the things that happened in the 1930s, and accepting that there's nothing you can do in the face of evil actions being taken place in other parts of the world, and also threats ultimately to your own society. There are serious, if you like, ethical problems with an absolute pacifist position, as well as there are with the alternative kind of just war tradition.